what does Vladimir Putin want? Well, sure, I mean, I know we enticed you to come here on this basis. I had to come up with something catchy to lure you, because I'm like the only guy who knows the answer to this question, right? You think I'm going to tell you right now? No. You think I'm going to tell you today? Well, I'll keep you guessing. But basically what I propose to do is talk a little bit about Vladimir Putin, talk about a little bit about his background, and because you're smart people, you already probably know all that anyway, and he's been around for a while, right? 16 years, that's a chunk of time. What would Obama do with 16 years? Well, who knows? And then I want to tell you a little bit about the context in which he operates, Russia, Russian political system, Russian economy, and who are some of the people behind him, around him, and where I think Russia is going. And then we're going to have time for Q&A, okay? So it's a pretty ambitious agenda, and so I'm going to dispense with some of this here, which makes it, which would make it probably boring anyway. So Vladimir Putin was born about 64 years ago in Leningrad, today known as Petrograd or St. Petersburg. The name kept changing under different regimes. And, pardon? You were born there?
My father was.
Oh, your father was born there, okay. And Putin's father was, well, he was, Putin's grandfather actually, apparently was a chef, a cook for Nadezhda Krupskaya, Lenin's wife. And later supposedly also occasionally cooked for Stalin. But his father was a soldier, and his family was located in St. Petersburg, as I said, when the Germans invaded in June 1941. And this became, the fate of Leningrad became one of the archetypal stories of Russia's Great Patriotic War. The city was under siege for about 750 days. It was cut off by the Nazis, encircled. It appeared it was going to fall, and there was just a desperate kind of resistance to letting Leningrad fall, and it was supplied from the northern route across the frozen sea and so on in a plight of desperation. And countless people perished. The Soviet troops were ordered to fight to death. Vladimir Putin's father was one of them who he barely survived this ordeal. Many people did not. Some members of his family did not. The city was cut off for significant chunks of time. People didn't have anything to eat. There were incidents of cannibalism. Okay, that's how bad it got. But in the end, the city survived. It epitomized the incredible spirit of resilience. And it kind of became the story of Russia, what the Russians call the Great Patriotic War. Today's estimates are that, I mean, it used to be said that 20 million people in the Soviet Union perished during the Second World War. How many Americans died during the Second World War, roughly? 400,000, 500,000, I think closer to 400,000 perhaps, but there we are. So that tells you something about the order of magnitude, right? Now, of course, we'll never know exactly, but the historians more recently, and the Soviet regime, I mean the Russian regime uses this number, they have enlarged that number to 27 million, okay? 27 million people perished. Some of them, of course, perished because Stalin missed the warning he received from Winston Churchill and others that the Germans were coming. They were going to violate the pact. that Stalin himself made in 1939 with Hitler, right? So it is said that Hitler was the only guy Stalin ever trusted. Well, that's an exaggeration, but the point is there was a Stalin-Hitler pact, 1939-1941. And so Vladimir Putin grew up in this family that was marked by the war, by the whole Soviet era, and he decided to join when he was even before he was of age. He was still in high school. He knocked on the door of the local KGB and he said he wanted to join, and they said, we decide who joins. You don't come to us, we come to you. You better go and study some more. And so he did. And so when he studied at an institute, a technology institute. Well, actually, he did get a degree from a law school, and later on, a PhD from a technological institute. Be that as it may, he joined the KGB, and he served in the KGB for 17 years. He ended up as a lieutenant colonel. It wasn't really an outstanding career, you might say. His last assignment was, well, as far as we know, was in Dresden, East Germany. I mean, the guys who were really making it were sent to West Germany. He was sent to East Germany. And that's where he was in 1989 when communism collapsed. And he saw firsthand the humiliation that the East German communist regime experienced, and the power of the streets, the people power, because this was in Dresden in East Germany, where people actually, towards the end, the waning months of the East German regime, they demonstrated. Protests took place daily against the regime, and the face of the enemy were the Stasi files, the secret police files, okay? So Putin could see that the end of the regime had come, but he also thought that the Soviet government then allowed a lot of good people who served that Soviet regime basically go under, or didn't give them their due. Anyway, I think it left him with a certain amount of bitterness. And one of the characteristics that, well, you might say there's several things that this story tells us. One, that he attached a lot of importance to loyalty. You stand by your friend. People who serve you, you work with you, you stand by them. And second, it is not said for nothing that once a KGB, always a KGB, or once an agent of the security services, you remain part of it, both in the sense of a mindset. You're not allowed to talk about certain things. Of course, that would apply to those Americans who serve in American intelligence services also. You're bound by the commitment. So, in any event, one of the aspects of Putin's rule over the years that's become evident is that he has rewarded loyalists. When he returned to, after East Germany, when he returned to St. Petersburg, he got his start in the administration of the mayor's office in St. Petersburg. And this was a man who, his name was Anatoly Sobchak, and Sobchak had a reputation of being a kind of a liberal in the still Soviet context. It was, remember, East German regime collapsed at the end of 1989, but the Soviet regime went on 91, right, at the end of 91. So there was still a Soviet regime, and Sobchak was a deputy in the parliament. Anyway, one of the people who remained loyal to him was Putin. Sobchak became subject of investigations and harassment, but Putin remained loyal to the end. And that's why I talk about the way he values loyalty. And second, when Putin, some of the circle of the people that he got to know who worked with him then became sort of the permanent circle of people around him. Okay, so there's like a network of the St. Petersburg circle, that has risen with him to the top. The other circle that has risen with him were the so-called Siloviki, people. This is people of power, or hard men, you might translate that as. Sila means power, and this relates to the KGB military segment of the USSR. Okay, Putin promoted such people over the years, and they populate now the St. Petersburg Friends and the Siloviki. They populate the senior circles of power around Putin today. And third, as I said, you reward your friends for loyalty. Putin has made it possible for these people to get rich. Okay? All right, well, that's maybe a traditional form of rewarding your friends. There are about, last year anyway, there were about 90 billionaires in Russia. Billionaires, this is on the Forbes list. And that's about 10 times as many as there were under the rule of Putin's predecessor, Boris Yeltsin. Okay? So there's a book out, recent book out, that if you're interested in the, they say, if you want to understand politics anywhere, follow the money. So that's what we're doing here. And basically these people, there were two waves of getting rich in Russia. The first wave started already under the Soviets in the waning years. Again, the KGB, people who had access to a network, who had studied languages, who were able to travel abroad and so on, they started to take preparatory steps to protect assets, both of the Communist Party, but also for themselves. And some of these folks would become the members of the key elite, the new elite in Soviet Russia. But others benefited immensely under Boris Yeltsin through historically unprecedented privatization. Soviet economy was 100% state-controlled economy. And under Boris Yeltsin, it was seen by reformers that privatizing the economy would be an overriding objective, should be an overriding objective, in order to make it impossible for the communists to come back. Okay? Make the changes irreversible by privatizing the state economy. So that started in 1992. This was the so-called shock therapy. Do it all at once. A lot of Western, especially American advisors were in on this, telling the Russians how to do this. I mean, even though it's never been done before. And of course, they too benefited from being in on these deals. Well, the short version of the shock therapy is there was a lot of shock for ordinary people who needed therapy. And I mean people on fixed wages, teachers, veterans of the war, retired folks. These people were thrown into poverty overnight because of skyrocketing inflation that accompanied this privatization, and because the government really failed to protect them. Okay? So Boris Yeltsin probably meant well, in as much as, he started off as a hero. Yeltsin was the guy who stood up in August 1991. There was a coup in Russia, in the Soviet Union. This was like the old forces of the old order, the KGB, the military. These folks wanted to basically put the genie back into the bottle. and Boris Yeltsin led the resistance. Okay, this was a coup against Gorbachev, August 1991, and Yeltsin and some of his loyalists had the guts to stand in front of the Russian parliament. There was a famous picture of Yeltsin on a tank resisting the organizer of the coup. So the coup was really inept. I mean, the people who organized it were inept, and it collapsed after about 3 days. But Boris Yeltsin was the leader of the resistance. So that's where he was veritably a popular leader. Unfortunately, in the 1990s, he frittered away the support that he had because, first of all, the economic, the shock therapy I just told you about, but also the disorder that beset Russia, which culminated with the war on Chechnya that you know about, which the regime waged brutally against this region in the Caucasus that wanted to separate itself from the rest of Russia. This couldn't be allowed, so the Yeltsin people thought, because it would set a precedent for other regions, all 89 regions might want to separate. And so following the Soviet disintegration, Russia might follow and disintegrate still further. That was the fear. And the government in Moscow was really powerless to stop it, okay? So basically the 1990s, I mean, Boris Yeltsin was a darling of Washington, of American presidents, Democrats, Republicans. He seemed to be a genuine friend of democracy, or he wanted democracy. He just didn't know how to go about it because he had been a long-term party member who rose to the top in the party, okay? So he had perhaps the right instincts, but he was also, unfortunately, a drinker. And so, like a lot of the Soviet leaders, in the course of the decade, he turned from this bold resistor into a kind of a drunken, decrepit old fellow in the course of a decade, okay? And there are a lot of incidents about Boris Yeltsin. But anyway, so at the end of this era, things were getting out of control. In 1996, Yeltsin's popularity was in single digits, and it looked like the communists were going to take over. The communist leader, his name was Ugana, he actually had, in this context of a unstable Russia, economically prostrate Russia, Russia that experienced defeat of the Cold, that's how it was seen, a defeat in the Cold War. Now the communists were going to come back. And so a bunch of these, half a dozen billionaires, the guys who got rich, their names were like Berezovsky, Gosinski, and others, they organized to save Yeltsin, and by hook and crook got him reelected, okay? From single digits back to the Kremlin. It was a miracle. But anyway, it just meant that he was that much more beholden to them. And the rest of the population, much of it, was impoverished and angry. And it's in this context that Boris Yeltsin started looking for someone to pass the baton to, someone who could be counted on to be Yeltsin's guy in the Kremlin, who could protect Yeltsin against the wrath and the anger of the streets, the communists, and everybody else, especially to protect Yeltsin from being prosecuted on account of many of his cronies getting rich, okay? So this was, Russia was in a kind of a wild capitalism, Klondike phase where chunks of the economy, maybe as much as 50% of the whole economy, ended up in the private hands of about a dozen oligarchs, okay? All right. So it turns out they found this, you know, there was this fellow from Leningrad who came to Moscow to work for the Yeltsin administration in the late 1990s, about 96. And he proved himself. He seemed to be doing well, whatever position he was entrusted. So first he had some role in the administration of the Yeltsin palace or whatever, Kremlin. Then he was given another position. Eventually he was given in 1998 the responsibility for running the FSB. The FSB was the renamed KGB. Okay? So that was quite a triumph. Certainly upon returning to the headquarters at the Lubyanka Square, now Putin, who had supposedly resigned from the KGB in August 1991, was returning triumphantly as the boss. And within a year, he was asked by Yeltsin to become prime minister. Now, this was a bad time for Yeltsin. I think Putin was like the 5th prime minister that year. That bad, or certainly a year and a half. So prime ministers kept coming and going. They could be blamed for whatever the problems beset the country. And so the fact that Vladimir Putin was put in there as a prime minister, everybody thought, okay, well, that's not going to last, and he is done for. But much to the surprise of the country, and to the surprise of Boris Yeltsin, Vladimir Putin himself, he was actually asked to become the acting president in a confidential meeting with Boris Yeltsin on the eve of, this was December 1999. And the next election was going to take place, presidential election in April. So it was clear Yeltsin couldn't run. Yeltsin couldn't run because the president was limited to 2 terms anyway. That's what the Constitution said. So he was looking for a successor, but he was afraid that any successor is going to punish him and the members of his family and go after the Yeltsin family on account of what both their personal enrichment and what had happened. All right, well, so one of the qualifications was for Putin to give Yeltsin an amnesty, which he did. And what was remarkable about this was that, well, at least 2 things. One, it marked the first time that a change of leadership in Russia took place in the context of this change from Yeltsin to Putin in a peaceful manner. That is to say, there was no handover. I mean, Yeltsin didn't become an unperson, much like Khrushchev did before him or others. And second, the change occurred with Boris Yeltsin addressing the people of Russia and apologizing to them, apologizing for not having lived up to the promise that he had made and the commitments that he undertaken. So Yeltsin at the end did issue an apology, and he introduced Vladimir Putin. And in a matter of few months, when the election took place, Vladimir Putin won, even though much of the country, when he was first introduced by Yeltsin, really didn't know who Putin was. As I said, these prime ministers kept coming and going, so there's no need to retain their names, right? Okay, so let's take a kind of a quick look on what happened. This was the Yeltsin decade. So here you see Russian GDP per capita year by year going down, okay? Now imagine, I mean, we had never experienced as a country anything remotely like this, but you can see what this did in constant prices. And it culminated in 1998 when the ruble collapsed, okay? It became like worth nothing. So you see, at least from this, what the Yeltsin decade economically meant, but it also meant instability, war in Chechnya, and so on. The war in Chechnya was wound down, but it wasn't finished because the Chechens continued to demand independence, and so and there were incidents of terrorism. And certainly one thing that we do have in common with Russia is their intimate understanding of the havoc that terror can bring. Okay, Russia has had many more terrorist incidents than we have, and in fact, in the Caucasus, there's constant incidents of violence, and many of them are instigated by Islamic fundamentalists. So Russia does have this problem. And I should add that when 9/11 took place, the first foreign leader to call George W. Bush to express sympathy was Vladimir Putin. And he offered to do whatever Russia could to help. Okay? So there were some bright moments in that story. All right, so here you have what happened under Putin. That's the decade or more. You can see that the Russian economy experienced a dramatic turnaround. Okay? A dramatic turnaround. Again, this is the same measure used, gross domestic product per capita. In this hiccup here was the financial crisis, 2008, 2009, but then it took off again. So the point is that Russia's standard of living since that low of 1998, however you measure it, if you want to use GDP per capita, whatever, has doubled. Okay? Real wages have more than doubled, I mean, in constant dollars. So, you know, around the world, many people measure the success or failure of politicians by the economic results, right? It's the economist, stupid, goes the same. By what's in your wallet. We see that in our country right now. So if you want to understand one fundamental reason for Putin's popularity, it would be this, okay? Now, it turns out it wasn't so much his doing, because a lot of it has to do with the price of oil and natural gas. So he benefited from that. And, you know, if we take it further, it goes down because of what's happened to the price of oil, which has gone down from, it was about $130 a barrel right there. And now it's been down to about $30 a barrel. So there's a major impact on the Russian economy. And the Russian economy is going like this, right, the last couple of years, okay, as a result. All right, so, okay, so this is what I was saying, just in another measure. And, you know, this is a significant improvement in the living standards, right? There's no way of disputing that. So the other reason why Putin has received rising support from the Russian society, or did in the decade, his first decade, was that he restored stability to Russia. Okay? He reined in the regions. He did it by hook and crook. But he was able to bring to heel these various governors from restive regions from around the country. And eventually in 2004, he used an incident of terrorism as a pretext to take away the elections of the governors. So basically the governors became his appointees. 89 regions, representatives of those regions subject to Putin's power and influence, okay? and he used the pretext of fighting terrorism to do that. All right, so here is the oil price that speaks to this. And now the other thing that Putin did, of course, was to more or less dismantle the kind of institutional underpinnings for democracy that Russia had, albeit with limitations, under Putin. Russia's, under Yeltsin, okay? Russia became, already under Gorbachev, a scene of competing political groups, political factions at first, and then political parties in contested elections. Unfortunately, it was a democracy imperfect. We noticed the role of money, right, under the oligarchs who bankrolled Yeltsin to get him reelected. But still, there was contestation in parliamentary elections and in presidential elections. The second thing there were media, pluralist media. Already under Gorbachev, a glasnost, so-called, meant openness, and that meant that television, radio, newspapers, and eventually the internet became sources of open debate, no censorship. And because of these oligarchs, financial oligarchs, own different chunks of the media, they use the media against each other to articulate and to press their competing interests. It actually constituted a kind of a sea of pluralism, the Russian media scene. Well, Yeltsin didn't like that. Nobody likes that. But he tolerated it, okay? Nobody likes that if you're a politician, being subject of criticism. So Yeltsin tolerated it, but with Putin would come change. First, he put the oligarchs on notice that you could keep your riches, you could keep what you stole, so long as you paid your taxes, you didn't meddle in politics, and when needed, you would support various projects the government needed to get done, like the Olympics. Okay? So these were the rules. Well, not everybody was prepared to tolerate those rules. One man, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, thought he could support political opposition. He happened to be the richest guy of them all, owned Yukos oil company. And Putin decided to teach him and everyone else a lesson. He had Khodorkovsky investigated on the basis of tax fraud, had him and the head of his company thrown into jail for 13 years, dismantled this private company, Yukos, and created the biggest Russian oil company called Rosneft, government-controlled, okay, out of that. So it was a very clear signal. The other oligarchs didn't wait. They ran away to Britain and elsewhere, and the ones who wanted to stay behaved, okay? So this happened to be a popular series of steps, actually, because they were seen as thieves anyway by the population at large. And so they had it coming in a way, okay? So in popular opinion, this wasn't a terrible thing. This is a good thing that Putin went after them. And so basically, the upshot of all this is what's happened to, we've looked at the economy. I've told you about some of Putin's steps to reestablish stability and order and control. And so when you look at independent agencies like the Freedom House, when they look at Russia, what do they see? Well, these colors tell you. See, these are all post-communist countries. That's what makes it interesting. So some countries here, Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, Slovenia, the Baltic states, they evolved into consolidated democracy. That's what the Freedom House. Freedom House is an independent organization based in the U.S. It's an NGO, and they do an annual survey. Then some of these countries developed into semi-consolidated democracies, or like Hungary have slid back. Hybrid regimes, as in Ukraine, Georgia, somewhere in between, and then of course semi-consolidated and fully consolidated authoritarian regimes. So this is Russia's ratings. This is the latest from the Freedom House, and what this tells you is that, you know, it's on a scale of 1 to 7. 7 is the lowest. So if you look at Russia's scores for 2005, they're really scraping the bottom, right? You can see the government has vanquished the independent media. Governance is considered basically, elections are not free and fair. Civil society suffers major pressure from the government. It's still holding on. These are non-government groups. Corruption, abysmal. Russia is about 130th from 160 countries. It's very near the bottom. So the overall democracy score very bad. So these are some of the more successful countries in terms of post-communist transitions. These are some in between. Now, what is notable is that Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were part of the USSR, at least for the interlude between the Second World War and 1991. And as you can see, they've made remarkable headway. And they are the only ones from the former Soviet Union who have. All the rest, only Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, but it's not it's like a low number. And these are all the Central Asian former Soviet republics, and Belarus and Russia. So anyway, this is the big picture. And here the Russians were asked in 2011 whether you're satisfied with the way things are going in Russia. You can see yes, 30%, 60% said no. Would you describe the current economic situation as good? Well, 2011, despite all the success, 60% didn't think it was that good. Have the changes since 1991 helped ordinary people? 70% don't think so. So the numbers are not very positive in terms of the overall comparison. And then you have this key question, which is often asked: what should we rely on to solve Russia's problems? 30% say democratic government. So you might say this is the potential support for democracy, simply simplified. A strong leader. So you can see that 2-to-1, the Russians still look toward a strong leader. Now, we have to bear in mind this is a country that had no experience with democracy, prior to the 1990s, right? No experience with democratic institutions. So we have a set of attitudes that speaks to that. All right, so let me mention a few other turning points here in Putin's journey. Now, Putin was entitled by constitution to 2 terms. 2000, he was elected. 2004 was the first term. 2004, 2008, the second term. So in 2008, everybody was asking, 2007, 2008, what is Putin going to do? Constitutionally, he's limited to 2 terms. He was popular in terms of public support, but that public support reflected the fact that the government now controlled the main sources of information, namely the television, on which people rely for news. So the government was able to shape information presented on television. Whenever an election would take place, it would cut off the opposition from having access to television. So, some of those numbers, high numbers of popular support for Putin are somewhat suspect, you might say. But be that as it may, the big question was, would Putin, my sense is that in 2008, given those results in the economy, had Putin decided, hey, to hell with Constitution, people demand it, people should have what they want, okay, I'm going to stay for another term, it wouldn't have caused a huge uproar. Instead, Putin chose to step down and nominated his right-hand man, Mr. Medvedev, who had been his chief of staff, who had been a loyal friend from the St. Petersburg days, a man trained in a law school, about 15, 20 years younger than Putin. And as soon as Medvedev received, Putin was able to throw all the support behind Medvedev. Medvedev was elected. There was hardly anyone who could run against him. And so the first thing Medvedev did was he appointed Putin as his prime minister. A nice thing. And so this is where, this was described as a bicycle tandem, these two paddling together. Now, people in the Democratic opposition thought this was a joke. This was clearly in defiance of any democratic rules and so on. But Medvedev took over, and he became president. And for the next 4 years, he had the mandate. And the big question was, 4 years later, whether Medvedev, entitled to a second term, would in fact stay on. And the game was played in such an ambiguous way that no one knew, not even Medvedev, till one night in December 2011, September, whether or not Vladimir would decide to come back. And the point is that the Russian Constitution says you're entitled to 2 terms, but if you take a break from the action, no reason why you couldn't come back, right? For another term, or 2, right? The clock starts over. So Vladimir Putin respected the Constitution. He stepped down, served as a prime minister, and now we had this young, youthful President Medvedev who appeared to talk a different language. He seemed to be emphasizing how Russia had to move away from disregard of the rule of law. He talked about legal nihilism. He was supportive of information technology to demonstrate he was from a different generation. He became a blogger, and he was an avid user of the internet. And so it appeared, a lot of people started getting, some people in the intelligentsia, among the critical opposition to Putin, started thinking that Medvedev represented a real alternative. And they were joined on this bandwagon by the Obama administration. The Obama administration was hoping against hope that Medvedev was for real, and that perhaps we could do things with Medvedev, like helping Russia to get into World Trade Organization. That would be in the interest of Russia. It would make Russia more transparent. It would also make Russia a better trading partner, and so on. So we supported Russia getting into WTO. We also got from Russia. And actually, this goes back to Putin. There were areas of cooperation that clearly we could work together, where we could work together. One of them was the Russians were enabling us to funnel weapons through Russia to Afghanistan. Okay? So this was certainly a valuable conduit for us to supply our troops in Afghanistan. Another was we actually opened up a military base in Kyrgyzstan, in Uzbekistan, I think, and the Russians kind of tolerated it for a time. So it seemed like, you know, there are areas where we can actually work together. And this happened before Medvedev. On Medvedev's clock, on the other hand, Russia in 2008 invaded Georgia. Okay, so Georgia was a former Soviet republic which wanted to join the European Union. It wanted to. The leaders of Georgia talked about joining NATO, and this whole question of NATO expansion was becoming an anathema for Moscow. It started off in the 1990s. There was a big debate in the United States what to do with NATO. The Cold War was over. The Warsaw Pact dissolved. So there were the voices saying, well, NATO, you know, should also be supplanted by some kind of a cooperative arrangement with Russia. But given the unrest in the Balkans, remember the wars of succession in the Balkans, 250,000 people died following the dissolution of Yugoslavia. We decided, and some of the East Europeans demanded, that NATO needed to stay and that NATO should be expanded to provide a kind of a security blanket for the newly post-communist countries of Central and East Europe, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, these Czech Republic, Slovakia, these countries wanted to join NATO. So under President Carter, we proceeded to expand NATO. And the Russians were, you know, not keen on the idea, but Yeltsin, hey, he was a friend. He said maybe Russia will join NATO too, who knows. Putin actually also repeated this idea, maybe Russia one day will join NATO too. Well, you would never know it today, because there is this bitter tone in Moscow about how we betrayed Russia following the collapse of communism, because a commitment, supposedly they argue, was made to Gorbachev that NATO troops would never expand into Central Europe, and that we betrayed this commitment. That's now sort of the official line in Moscow, even though there is really no evidence that any such commitment had been made, okay? So my point is, 2008, Russian troops march into Georgia, and this is seen as a violation of the spirit of our partnership with Russia. It happens under Medvedev, although it would have happened under Putin anyway. And Medvedev asserts that Russia has a privileged sphere of influence in the former, basically well, he says in this part of the world. Okay, he doesn't spell it out what he means by that. Where does it apply? Does it apply to the Baltic states too? But anyway, and so suddenly there's this talk that Russia has a privileged sphere of influence, and Georgia made a big mistake of babbling about wanting to join NATO, and that's not going to happen, and here we are to demonstrate this is not going to happen. All right, well, so by this time we are at loggerheads, United States and Russia, and there was an attempt in 2009 sort of to reload the button, to restart the relationship. That happened with the Obama administration in the hope that Medvedev would be a different kind of guy and that we could do business with him, okay? It remained a hope, but hope unfulfilled, because he was not the main guy. He didn't, first of all, Putin retained all the levers of power when he moved on to be prime minister,
He kept some of the prerogatives of the president, especially in the foreign policy area. Second, Putin had the network of the Siloviki, the former KGB security types, who populated the Kremlin and the government agencies. Medvedev didn't have any such background, so he was an outsider. Third, Putin controlled the people who controlled the big companies, now state-controlled, like Rosneft, right, the big oil company. So he could use the resources of those state companies both to reward loyalists and also to further Russian interests abroad, which they did. Anyway, so it was a huge disappointment to many when it was announced in, okay, I had a slide there which didn't come out, but when it was announced that Putin was coming back, I'm saying it wouldn't have been a disappointment to many in the society at large, but it was a disappointment to the democratic opposition, the intelligentsia, the United States, when in fact Medvedev was not allowed to do a second term. And, you know, basically Medvedev wasn't allowed to do a second term as president because Putin wanted to come back, and that was that. It was a delusion that Medvedev was somehow an independent actor who could act on his own. And I think even Medvedev succumbed to the delusion. So there was an election, 2011, and it reflected a kind of a certain amount of bitterness against this ruling party. Basically, United Russia Party was created for one purpose only, to support Vladimir Putin. And it had a free run of the Russian parliament, but in that, until 2011. But in that election, it lost 77 deputies. So this was, you know, this was 15% less than what it had before. And this election, by all accounts, had to be manipulated. There was a lot of ballot stuffing and people voting twice and so on, even to get this result, okay? So the allegations of fraud just brought out the people into the street, and I don't know whether we can actually do anything with this. How would I get this to work? No, I just turned it off. Sorry, that's bad. Maybe that's good. So the point is that there was a massive protest in December 2011, and it was a kind of a turning point. For all the resources in Putin's hands, the control of the media, the economic levers of power, the Siloviki, the United Russia Party, it was clear that there was a disaffection, strong sense of disaffection in the Russian society. And some of the people who came out into the streets, and there were about 100,000, it was the largest protest in the Putin era, were in fact the new middle class people whom, you know, the prosperity of Russia created. So that was 2011. And then, of course, the following year, Putin got himself re-elected, and that was that. So he got another 4 years. And one contribution that President Medvedev made was that he proposed to the Russian parliament that, as soon as he himself became president, that the presidential term be extended. 4 years was not long enough to get anything done, so the presidential term was extended to 6. So as a result, 2012 election, Vladimir Putin got 6 years, right? 6 years. And so, you know, he seems to be in good health. I had some wonderful pictures of Vladimir Putin displaying his body to the public. You've perhaps seen that. Now has a veritable cult of personality. So, if his health holds up, then he could be Russia's president to 2024, right? 2024. Well, that's a long time, and I suspect that that's what's going to happen. Indeed, if his physical health holds up, because I believe that he's so ensconced in power that short of a massive public protest, which would have to be linked to the downfall of the economy, he will not be dislodged. But there is and this is, I'm kind of making my way towards the end. There is a sense in which, authoritarian leaders who are skillful at what they do, they rely on economic performance as a form of maintaining themselves in power. So clearly, those who can and do ensure durability of their rule, or can. So that's what Vladimir Putin has banked on doing. But the story doesn't end there, because what's happened in the last year and a half has put that proposition at risk. One, we've seen the energy prices have collapsed. And two, so has the ruble. So Russia's overall economic health is far from what it was. Russia's economy is projected to decline 2-3% this year. It did that last year, so this is a first. But of course, Vladimir Putin argues that Western sanctions are to blame for this. But the real culprit, the sanctions do matter, and they have affected, I think, Russian prospects. The oil price matters more, but the real culprit is the failure of the Putin regime to diversify the economy, to invest in infrastructure, roads, and education, and healthcare, and all of that, and to have allowed for a significant chunk of the national wealth to end up in corrupt hands of the oligarchs who are being rewarded by Vladimir Putin for their loyal support. I did not get into, as I had intended, the ramifications of the Ukrainian crisis. So let me say a few words about that. This was the first time that sovereignty of a country in post-war, post-communist Europe was violated in this crude fashion. The Crimea and the seizure of Crimea, I don't believe was a premeditated move on the part of Putin. I think this was one of those things that Putin had on his shelf, that if the need come, this is something that can be done. And so in the context of the revolution in Ukraine, this was the second revolution, the first one took place 2004, in 2012, 13, 14, Putin dusted off the shelf because it looked like all the effort that he invested in maintaining Ukraine in the Russian orbit had failed or had collapsed. It looked like Ukraine was going to now make a deal with the European Union, and it was going to lean westward. And Ukraine had, over the previous few years, desperately tried to keep Ukraine in the Russian orbit. So that's one level of analysis. Another level of analysis is that, so basically, he unfolded, the scenario unfolded where the people, there was a referendum held in Crimea, but that was a ridiculous referendum. No one really could take that seriously. It was all, done in the presence of some men in green uniforms who wore no insignia, and Putin and Moscow claimed they didn't know anything about that. And it was basically done in a KGB style. And so I think it was as much the way what was done as the way it was done that really assaulted the senses of Western leaders. But then to make it worse, because Crimea was one thing. Crimea had obviously its own history, and we won't go into that. But then Putin, in what was a war of choice, proceeded to destabilize eastern Ukraine. And created, in order to bring the capital, the Kiev government, to heel. And there was no indication the year before that anything like that was in the making. So this was a deliberate orchestration on the part of Moscow to create instability, to basically pressure the government in Kiev to refrain and desist, and to basically keep it dependent on Russia, to refrain and desist from making a deal with the West. And then to make it even worse, it was the so-called rebels in Ukraine. In fact, these were some hired veterans, Russian veterans, who were manning these weapons, who shot down the Dutch airliner. And that was like the final straw. So basically the West had no choice but to confront Vladimir Putin with sanctions, because the only alternative would be to go to war, and no one was prepared to go to war on account of Ukraine. But the biggest worry was and remains a different kind of scenario, which is this. So let me just wrap this up. So Ukraine is an unfinished business. What does Vladimir Putin want? Well, he wants Ukraine that will remain part of the Russian sphere of privileged interests. He wants Ukraine codependent on Russia. And of course, Ukraine is a place in the Russian political mind that's unlike any other. The very beginnings of Russia are entwined with the so-called Kievan Rus. Centuries ago, this is kind of the Jerusalem of the Russian founding, if you like, as the Russians see it. So their attitude is that Ukraine shouldn't even be independent. I'm talking about societal attitude. So that's where Putin has a lot of support from the society at large. Average Russian doesn't think Ukraine is really a separate country to this day. And, history of Ukraine as an independent country is not a centuries-old proposition either. There isn't that much of it. And Ukraine internally is comprised of the Western-leaning Ukrainians, Catholics, and the Orthodox Eastern-leaning Russians. It's not that simple. It's more entwined than that. But simply put, Ukraine itself is not a country that's of one identity. And that's what makes it possible for the country of Ukraine to be torn in different directions, okay? The bottom line is that there's no solution without, the West is not going to bail out Ukraine. It's a country of, nearly 50 million. We're not going to be able to fix Ukraine's problems. Ukraine, if anything, is even, more corrupt than Russia. And it has retained more political pluralism than Russia, but it has fundamental challenges. So, and Ukraine isn't going to move. It's where it is. It's in Russia's neighborhood. So the only way we can actually, in the long run, fix Ukraine is to work with Russia in some way. I mean, for the Ukrainian stability and prosperity eventually to arrive. So the idea that Ukraine could somehow jump and become a member of NATO, and Ukraine, half the Ukrainians don't even want to be members of NATO. So it's really not a viable prospect. But so this is what we might call a frozen conflict, okay? And it may well be that, I mean, there's been some semblance of stability, some peace, but ultimately I believe that we're going to have to find a way to deal with Russia to bring long-term stability to this part of the world. I think Vladimir Putin, unfortunately, is bent on causing more trouble. If you look at the logic of Putin's rule, he's taken away the media, he's taken away democratic institutions. This is now a one-man rule. I mean, Medvedev learning the night before his fate, when Vladimir finally decided to tell him, is an example. The decision to go into Crimea, to seize Crimea, one man's decision. No one knew that was coming in Russia. You could see the confusion among the officials, the high-level Russian foreign minister. They were all lying because they didn't have the information about what to say. Nobody was prepared. So, hence the cult of personality, because Vladimir Putin is now the institution. And as the top right-hand man, the chief of his staff, said the other day, or last year, Russia is Putin. No Putin, no Russia. And now think about that. On the other hand, there are people who believe that this kind of system that Putin has created could probably be recreated even without him, or maintained even without him. But that's for another conversation. So what is troubling to me in looking at all this is the question of, well, what sources of support can Vladimir Putin generate now in 2016? If he cannot rely on the oil-rich economy or energy-rich economy to be the engine, as it's been under him, and we know what's happened to the energy sector, right? A lot of alternative sources of energy. The United States is becoming an exporter, shale, and all of this. So chances are that the price of oil isn't going to go anywhere near what makes Russian budget a balanced proposition. All right, so that standard of living is not it. It's certainly not the democratic institutions. It's not political parties. Those don't play any meaningful role. Well, then there is one tool, and this is where I'm going to conclude, that remains available to Vladimir Putin to generate broad support. And his popularity ratings were never higher than following the seizure of Crimea, where they reached 80+%, and they have remained more or less there. What surveys of public opinions of Russia have indicated over the many years is that the Russians attach a very high value to the notion of Russia as a great power. Russia as a great power, which it has been historically. Russia was also a superpower. And so the notion that Russia will not be kicked around anymore, which it was under Yeltsin, and that Russia is a proud country, which has a role to play in the world, is very strongly embedded. And so it is up to Vladimir Putin whether he uses that strong sentiment in his country towards making Russia a worthy great power that plays a constructive role. And some might even argue that's what Russia has done in Syria, although it followed its own interest. Or whether aggressive foreign policy, as we have seen in Ukraine, Georgia, is really the last repertoire for legitimizing Putin's rule at home. So that's the thought I want to leave you with. Good question. What does Mr. Putin want in Syria? Well, in the first place, he wants to protect Russian interests. Russia had been deeply embedded or in bed with the Assad regime, both father and son. There was a close relationship over many decades. Second, this is really the last outpost of Russian influence in the Middle East, therefore all the more important. And more specifically, the military base, the port in Syria, it gives Russia access to the Mediterranean. So that's a strategic asset. And third, I think that Putin was deeply disturbed by what happened to Muammar Gaddafi and other autocrats in the Middle East. Small wonder. And he's been very disturbed by, coincidentally, but relatedly, by this notion of orange revolution in Ukraine or tulip revolution in Kyrgyzstan. Any spontaneous movement from below, he finds that an anathema and a threat, and that's why he's tightened his rule at home. But to get back to the Middle East. So, and I think that, you know, this role of Russia as a player. Because in the early years of the Putin rule, there was, you know, all kinds of dialogue and summit meetings and G8 and all of this. But by about 2005, 6, Putin grew wary of Russia being ignored. In his view, the United States would act unilaterally. I mean, this is what happened in Iraq, right? And he didn't see any incentives or fewer and fewer incentives for Russia in looking at this relationship as a partnership. So there was a kind of a, and you know, there's some basis to that view. We did not think we needed to respect not only the Russian perspective, but that of Germany and France. We went into Iraq unilaterally. And so, you know, the Middle East is, of course, now a cauldron. And Russia has some interests. It doesn't appear, apart from the Syrian regime, the Assad regime, to have really any partners in the region. So I think these are some of the reasons why they chose to intervene. Again, there wasn't any popular demand I know of in Russia for the Russian army or air force to get involved. It was one man's decision. And to demonstrate, and this is a big play at the UN, right? When last year, on the anniversary of the UN creation, Putin made a speech, and he presented himself as someone who is on the right side, who wants to lead the fight against terror. And he invited the United States to do that. But no sooner did he do that, that his Air Force proceeded to bomb some of the people we call moderates And clearly, his interests in Syria were in the first place to throw support behind this what appeared to be collapsing Assad regime. Now, again, you know, Russia has national interests, and they are in evidence in Syria, and it is pursuing them, and it is playing well at home up to a point, because Russia is showing that it is a great power who cannot be ignored. And the fact is, you know, Secretary of State Kerry spent many hours in Geneva negotiating, and you know, a ceasefire is holding for the second month or fourth week or something like that in Syria. People are still dying. Russia announced it has withdrawn, or it is pulling out a couple of weeks ago, but for some reason they're still bombing targets, so they're kind of out, but they're in. And so Russia is doing it out of all of these reasons. Do you have some other thought on that or additional perspective?
No, it just seemed like a stretch.
Well, look, the whole world kind of stands by watching this humanitarian catastrophe. The Russians, I mean, the Russian government, Putin, got some credit out of this, out of Russia's involvement, because Russia did something that, you know, brought about ceasefire, okay? You can't remove that. Earlier, a couple of years back, when Obama drew a red line in Syria, chemical weapons, and then there was evidence that chemical weapons were in use. He forgot about the red line, and Vladimir Putin saved him by stepping in and proposing to remove those chemical weapons from Syria, which did happen. So again, you know, there are a lot of areas, especially when it comes to terror and war on terror and cooperation and nuclear issues, and Russia was to some extent a constructive player on Iran as well. So there are areas where we could actually work together, but you know, this Crimea and Ukraine was a major setback because it was in violation of whatever we assumed was the case, that the territorial integrity of all the countries in Europe would be respected.
Yes.
Yeah. So do you have any concerns that if the price of oil doesn't come back and Russia's economy continues to deteriorate, Putin, in order to remain in power and appeal to the Russian people, will actually go further in Ukraine and just annex it?
I think Ukraine is not Georgia. So, I mean, they didn't do that even in Georgia. But I don't think annexation of Ukraine is really what Putin wants. It would be they have a hard time keeping the lights going in Crimea. You know, Russia was going to bring all of these investments to Crimea, but it hasn't happened. So the point is that, you know, basically Moscow has advocated this view that Ukraine should be neutral. It should not definitely join. It should stop talking about NATO. Ukraine should work with Russia and not the European Union, and so on. But you know, that kind of that neglects the fact, a small fact, namely that Ukraine is an independent country. It's one of the fourth largest country in Europe or something like that, right? So who is Russia to tell Ukraine, which has held a series of free elections, about what Ukraine should or shouldn't do? But there are these hard facts of life, and Ukraine denuclearized. Ukraine's army is incapable of standing up to Russia. And the way it is in the international system, it is the big and powerful who who have more say than all the others. Or I should say everybody is equal except for the big and powerful. So I worry, I mean, we can worry that, Vladimir Putin will be opportunistic, will press where he can. And the biggest worry, I think, that we have now are the Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania, because they are members of NATO, and they all contain Russian minorities. And one of the justifications for this incursion into Crimea and into eastern Ukraine was the protection of Russian speakers. So, it wouldn't take much. We've seen the scenario unfold in eastern Ukraine. If Vladimir Putin wanted to test the resolve of NATO, to orchestrate protests in Latvia, and of the Russian speakers demanding Russian assistance, and test NATO's capacity to act, because NATO's Article 5 says attack on any one member is an attack on all, right? Collective security. And so would the American people be prepared to go to war with Russia over the fate of Lithuania or Latvia? Are we? Yes.
Is the Muslim population in the Russian countries and spheres of influence, whatever you want to call it, is that a ticking time bomb that Russia is just, is very fearful of? I mean, it's a huge population.
Yes, and demographically, it's a growing population, and indeed, in Chechnya, Dagestan, Ingushetia, these small, seemingly specks on the big map, Ossetia, these Transcaucasus, these have been the hotbeds of Islamic mobilization, if you like. So yes, it's very worrisome because Russia, does have nuclear facilities, and they're not always sure where all of their warheads are. And so, Vladimir Putin, I think, is genuine when he refers to Russia as being a potential partner in the war on terror. I mean, apparently, when the incident in Boston took place, the Boston Marathon, the Russians had informed our intelligence agencies about these two brothers. It's just that nobody was paying attention. So there is some level of cooperation that was going on, and undoubtedly still is. But we've also had, we've had a major falling out over the last couple of years. So this is on the one hand, there are these arguments for cooperation. On the other hand, the expectation is that Russia will do something to demonstrate its commitment to the integrity of Ukraine. They cannot just kind of sit there because it did initiate and orchestrate the crisis. But there's pressure now on Russia to act because of the economic situation at home. So in a sense, you could say, well, Putin is going to wait it out till the next president is. He says, Donald Trump is a good guy. So perhaps with the new administration, they can take some new initiatives. Well, thank you very much.